Okay, so hi everyone and welcome. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Claire Parkinson as our invited speaker for the delayed 2020 Reberg Lecture. Dr. Parkinson spent her undergraduate career at Wellesley College in Massachusetts, where she graduated with highest honors in 1970 with a degree in mathematics. She received master's and PhD degrees in geography and climatology from the Ohio State University in 1977. Dr. Parkinson then joined the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center in 1978, and she has remained there ever since. Dr. Parkinson has received an impressive number of honors in her career. Among many other awards, she was the first female recipient of the Gold Plate Polar Medal from Ohio State's Byrd Polar Research Center in 2004. She has received multiple NASA Achievement Medals, including most recently the Distinguished Service Medal, which she was awarded in 2020. Dr. Parkinson is a fellow of the American Meteorological Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, and the American Geophysical Union. She was elected to the U.S. National Academy of Engineering in 2009, the American Philosophical Society in 2010, and the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 2016. She has authored well over 100 scientific publications and is either the author or editor of 15 books. She was the lead author for the first Atlas of Arctic Sea Ice based on satellite data. She's written a textbook on climate modeling, and in her spare time, she wrote a book on the history of science from the year 1202 to 1930. Dr. Parkinson has been a strong supporter for women in science and led a Woman of Goddard effort that produced a book and related set of 6 posters highlighting women in STEM careers at NASA Goddard, aimed at encouraging girls to consider STEM careers. Dr. Parkinson enjoys handing these products out to children and talking with them about the excitement of science. When fact-finding about Dr. Parkinson, I learned that she has never owned or rented a car, and for over 40 years has routinely jogged to and from work, irrespective of weather conditions. So through snowstorms, sleet, hail, 100-degree temperatures. So basically nothing like what we have here in Irvine. I particularly love this fact because it personifies her strength and determination, which is exactly how she is trailblazed as a woman of science. I will now pass it over to Professor Isabella Vellacogna, who will introduce her talks this week and today's lecture.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And for this past year lecture, Liz and I were looking for a role model for women in earth science, and Claire Parkinson stood right at the top of the possible speaker. And we wanted to take full advantage of her virtual presence, and so we organized a full series of events in concert with the Reberg lecture, this lecture. And as Liz indicated, Claire has spent her entire career in NASA. In 1993, she became the project scientist of the Aqua satellite, which was launched in 2002, and which is still in operation today. Aqua is a complex platform and has collected tons of data of the world's ocean, land, atmosphere, and ice to inform us about climate change. Claire will talk about to us about the Aqua satellite during a special seminar that will take place on Friday at 11 a.m. And you can find the link in the chat. And if you want to know what it takes to manage such a large Earth mission for 30 years, you should come to listen to Claire on Friday. Claire Parkinson also has been a very strong advocate for women in science for her entire career. And we asked Claire if she would be willing to lead a discussion about women in science. We are very lucky that she accepted. And so we're going to be holding this event on Friday afternoon at 12:30 p.m. And we will have participation from all over the US. And there's going to be like young scientists, and this is not limited to women. I think there is a very good occasion. So please join our virtual conversation to learn about Claire's experience dealing with diversity in NASA from the early days of 1978 to present. And you can have the opportunity to ask her question and her insight. And I'm going to move to today's Reberg lecture. This is the 2020 Reberg lecture. which for the first time in its young history is now officially named a lecture in the School of Physical Sciences. And we want to thank the Dean for this, James Bullock, for making this happen. For the River Lecture, Claire will talk about to us about her work as a scientist who used satellite data to examine the Earth climate and climate change. She has specialized in sea ice in the Arctic and Antarctica since 1978. In 1989, she published a paper about the dramatic decrease in Arctic sea ice since the 1970s. And the study was confirmed in 1999, accompanied by other results that shows that the sea ice was thinning, and the rest is history for now. So the sea ice decay is one of the most spectacular and undisputed climate change signals. And more recently, she published an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science showing that the Antarctic sea ice, long thought to be stable or even slightly growing for several decades, has plunged into rapid decay since 2014. And this rapid decay has baffled scientists, and she's going to talk about all this mystery today. And with no further ado, I give you, Claire, the stage.
Okay, Isabella and Elizabeth, thank you so much for those wonderful introductions. I am now hopefully going to successfully share my screen here. And please let me know if it's come up. Has it come up?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm very honored to be selected as this year's Rieberg Lecturer, and I want to thank Elizabeth and Elliot, Brenda, Eric, and especially Isabella for all the effort, and it was quite a bit of effort to put together everything. So thanks very much. I did get on the UC Irvine website to look up about the Rieberg Lecture Series, and the explanation from Professor Rieberg is really very informative, especially about the Department of Earth System Science, which certainly sounds like a tremendous success as a department. And so congratulations to him and everybody else who helped found that department. He also mentioned in his comments that the department very much recognizes the importance of having both the observations and the modeling. And so after seeing that video, I decided that even though my talk is centered on observations, I did throw in a few modeling results. And that's partly because I did start out as a modeler. My PhD dissertation was a model of, centered on creating a model of sea ice. So with that introduction, I started at NASA in 1978. At that time, there were lots of data that had come out from NASA satellites in the 1970s, and a huge need to get these data analyzed. And two of the most important satellites are shown here. One was the first Landsat satellite on the left, and then the other one, the Nimbus 5 satellite. Both of these were launched in 1972. Both had a lot of data coming that had been obtained. And Dave Atlas, the director of the Goddard Laboratory for Atmospheric Sciences, was in the process of hiring people to try to analyze these data. So I was one of the lucky people hired, and in my case, it was to be in a sea ice group to look at what we can see about sea ice from satellite data. And these three pictures are just to give anybody a sense who might not have ever seen sea ice, just of what it looks like. And at the edge, it can be very sparse, or it can be kind of compact. In the middle of the sea ice cover, if the sea ice gets as thick as a meter or two, then you can very safely land things like a helicopter on it. So sea ice can be substantial, but it's not very thick. It's not like an iceberg. Sea ice is formed from seawater, freezing of seawater. An iceberg comes from land ice and is much, much thicker. So sea ice, if sea ice is 5 meters thick, it's very thick for sea ice. So sea ice extends over a very large area. These two pictures show the average conditions at the end of summer and the end of winter in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. So the white areas show the end of summer, and then the white and green together show the end of winter, or the midwinter. And these illustrate how in both hemispheres, the sea ice covers a lot of area. In the wintertime sea ice coverage in the Arctic, it tends to be about 15 million square kilometers. In the Antarctic, it's even more. It's about 18 million square kilometers. The area of the US is just under 10 million square kilometers. It's more like 9.5 million square kilometers. So the Arctic sea ice cover is more than 1.5 times the area of the US, and the Antarctic sea ice coverage in winter is even greater than that. So it's a huge area that's being covered by sea ice. And the sea ice does matter. And this slide shows a few of the ways in which it matters. Sea ice is white. Most of the sun's radiation that comes down and hits the ice cover gets reflected off and goes back to space. If the sea ice isn't there, the sun's radiation basically goes to the oceans and gets absorbed in the ocean and stays within the Earth's system, further heating the system. So the very presence of sea ice in the polar regions helps to keep the polar regions colder than they would be if the sea ice weren't there. Sea ice is also a strong insulator, restricting exchanges of heat, mass, and momentum from the ocean to the atmosphere. It also affects plant and animal life. The polar bears in the Arctic and penguins in the Antarctic are the ones that are most talked about, but there are a whole lot of other animals that are affected by sea ice. So it has a huge influence on plant and animal life. Some life forms actually live within the ice, so very microscopic life forms. So it affects plants and animals of all scales. And then it, of course, affects humans who are trying to do things in the Arctic and the Antarctic also. This is the group that was put together to look at the early sea ice data. Everybody on this group is from NASA Goddard except Bill Campbell. He was from the USGS. So it was Jay Zwally, who was the head of the group when I came into it. Joey Camiso, Don Cavalieri, Frank Carsey, and Per Glorson were all here at Goddard. And Bill and Per are now deceased, and the others are retired, although Joey and Jay sometimes do come around. Sea ice from Landsat, visible imagery, can come out looking really great. The picture on the left shows sea ice just the way you would see it if you were in a plane. And it's a great information about the sea ice cover. However, the picture on the right shows why we really don't concentrate on the visible imagery, because the visible imagery has all the restrictions that our eyes have. It's got all the benefits of our eyes, the sea ice picture on the left looks just like what we would see, but on the right, it shows that if there's a cloud in the way, then the cloud is going to obscure the information from the sea ice. So that's why we generally don't use the visible imagery for our attempts at climate studies. And the other limitation, prime limitation, would be if it's dark out, just like our eyes can't see things if it's dark. Well, same thing, if the satellite imagery is visible, it's not going to see things if it's dark either. And in the polar regions, it can be dark for months at a time. So instead, we use microwave. Microwave radiation has a huge benefit in that it can go straight through most clouds, so we can get our data even if there are clouds in the way. And then also, the microwaves are coming from within the Earth's system. It's not reflected radiation from the sun like most of the visible radiation is, but it's coming from within the Earth's system, so it doesn't matter whether the sun's out or not. We can get our data whether it's dark or light out, and even in the presence of clouds. These two pictures here illustrate what we were facing when we were starting to look at the data. There are lots of missing data. So especially in the left-hand picture, all the black area is missing data. The instrument was the electrically scanning microwave radiometer, abbreviated ESMR, on the Nimbus 5 satellite. It was a proof of concept instrument, and it was phenomenal in proving the concept that microwave radiation would be a really effective way of getting sea ice and lots of other variables. Other groups at Goddard were looking at some of the other variables, but we were looking at sea ice. So, but we did have this problem that there was a huge amount of missing data. And so what we did was we averaged to monthly averages, and picture on the left shows the month of September 1973 in the same kind of what we call brightness temperatures. It reflects the radiative information received from the satellite. So, and so we took the monthly images, and then we converted from the monthly image to a sea ice concentration image. So we converted from the brightness temperature to sea ice concentration on the right. And we essentially just grayed out the land areas, since they clearly don't have sea ice. And we colored light blue everything that was open water. And the ESMR instrument on the Nimbus 5 satellite had only one channel of information. So we could only essentially do one calculation with it. And so we got estimated sea ice concentrations from those data. And essentially we took a tie point for the ocean values of 135 Kelvin and a tie point for the sea ice values, more like about 240 Kelvin, and then we linearly interpolated to get the concentration of the sea ice. Sea ice concentration refers to the percent aerial coverage of sea ice. Now, this picture on the right was not a big surprise. I mean, it looked like what people might have expected sea ice coverage to look like in September. However, the next 3 years, and the ESMR got us a 4-year record, the next 3 years had this area of open water in the top portion of this picture, the open water area. It's in a sea called the Weddell Sea. And Russian word for a big open area in the sea ice cover is Polinia. So this is the Weddell Polinia. So this was a surprise, and people were certainly wondering why this open area. And this is the one thing in our early years of using these data, the one thing that actually got some media coverage, not much media coverage, but the tabloid, the Globe, came up with an explanation for this open water area as a UFO base found under the Antarctic. Now, none of us thought it was a UFO base, but the Globe figured something's generating heat, it can be a UFO base. This is one area where I did use my sea ice model to look at, could I somehow create a Weddell polynya? And it was very easy to do with the model by simply changing the wind fields. So this shows results from that model. And by changing the wind fields, you can see a Weddell polynya forming in the July 15th images on the right-hand side here, on cases B and C, with those two shifting of the winds. So this was something that a model could prove effective in simulating that, at least in that particular sea ice model, you could create this phenomenon of the Weddell polynya simply by changing the wind fields. Now, this doesn't mean the wind fields caused it in the real world, but it does mean that in that model, you could form a polynya and you could change its location by a shift in the wind fields. So we worked on these for quite a few years to get, and came out with two books. The first was, we did the Antarctic case first because it was the easier case because of its not having all the multiple ice types, or at least as much of the multiple ice types as the Arctic has. So we did the Antarctic first, and Jay Zwally was the lead on that, and that was published in 1983. And then we shifted to look at the Arctic, and I became the lead at that point to work on the Arctic Atlas, and we got that one out and published in 1987. Now, by that time, another satellite had been launched and already had a longer record than the ESMA record that was the 4-year record that we did those two books on. So the Nimbus 7 satellite had a scanning multi-channel microwave radiometer, or SIMR, on it. It was launched in October of 1978, which unfortunately did not allow it to overlap with the information from the Nimbus 5 ESMA. But it was a much more advanced instrument. It could benefit from the proof of concept imager from the Nimbus 5 satellite. And it was multi-channel, allowed us to do a lot more than we could do with just the single channel instrument. And then since that time, there've been a sequence of multi-channel microwave instruments in space. And so we have a fairly continuous record from essentially November of 1978 on up until the present. It was late October that the SIMR instrument was launched. So the follow-on instruments are from the Defense Department, the DMSP SSMI, Special Sensor Microwave Imager, and then others include an instrument that Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency's AMSR-E instrument, it's spelled out on the slide, and a subsequent AMSR instrument on another Japanese satellite. The AMSR-E is on NASA's Aqua satellite. So there's been a sequence of microwave imagers allowing us to get a record that goes back to the late 1970s. And this shows 4 different channels of for March 1st of 1999, just as a sample to show you the information you can get from 4 different channels. It's 19 gigahertz vertical on the upper left and 19 gigahertz horizontal on the lower left, 22 gigahertz vertical and 37 gigahertz vertical. So you can see, especially in the lower left picture, that the sea ice boundary is really sharply delineated once you get used to where the sea ice is, but it's really sharp in the image on the lower left. The upper left also, once you see it so clearly on the lower left, you see that it's the exact same location for the sea ice edge on the upper left. And then the other 2 also show the sea ice location really well, but a little more difficult to see with this particular color scale. Now, if you look at these 4 images and you try to figure out where the snow cover on the land is, I mean, it's impossible. I mean, you can't distinguish it. So we were lucky in terms of looking at sea ice, which did come out so clearly on these images, versus the group that was trying to figure out snow cover from the same image, the same data set. So here's the picture of what the sea ice concentrations are from using those 4 channels of information. So again, concentration is the percentage aerial coverage. We're not getting the thickness from these data sets. The thickness is a wonderful advance is that radiometry, radar altimetry and laser altimetry are now able to tell us something about the thickness of the sea ice cover. But early on, there were no satellites that were able to get the thickness, but we were able to get the concentration and the distribution of the ice. As you'll notice that there's a black circle in the middle, that simply reflects the orbit of the satellite, so it didn't get quite to the pole, so there's missing data in the pole region. Now, Don Cavalieri and I published these plots in a paper in 1989, where we used the simmer data, and the simmer lasted until August of 1987. So these are the results from November of 78 until August of 1987. And you can see that on the left picture, basically all you see is there's a lot more ice in winter than in summer, which everybody would have expected anyway. But when you look at the yearly averages, you can see a slight tendency toward a decrease. Now, this wasn't hugely convincing. However, by this time, the late 1980s, there was increased concern about global warming possibilities. And certainly we could tell that it would be really valuable to continue this data record and to see if this slight indication of a possible decrease in the Arctic sea ice was going to continue. So we went to what ended up being a considerable effort to get the simmer data from the Nimbus 7 satellite matched up well with the subsequent data sets from the SSMI. And when we did that, and then in 1999, we were able to publish results through the end of December of 1996. And this was the result. And again, at this point, it's still certainly not convincing at all from monthly averages. I mean, again, what you see from monthly averages is just there's a lot more ice in the winter than in the summer. But when we took monthly deviations to take out the seasonal cycle, we get the plot at the bottom, and then it becomes more convincing that there is a trend toward decreasing ice cover. Now, it wasn't entirely convincing because in the last year, the data set in 1996, there were some high values. So, but it was much more convincing than a decade earlier. The monthly deviations, the way to calculate those, or at least the way we calculate them, is very simple calculation. For the first point, which is November of 1978, we subtracted from that data point, we subtracted the average of all the Novembers. And so we create a data point that just shows how much that varied from all the Novembers. And so that's the point plotted for November of 1978 on the bottom. And we did that for every point. We just compared it with the same month in all the other years. And so that's what the monthly deviations indicate. So now it turns out that right about the time that that paper was published, there was a paper published by Drew Rothrock and his colleagues from the University of Washington that showed thickness results from submarine data, and they showed a significant thinning. In fact, at that point, it was 40% thinning that they showed in the Arctic ice over 2 periods from that they were comparing. They did amend that 40% number later when they got more data from the submarine data were being released bit by bit. So when they got more of the submarine data, they were able to modify, instead of 40% thinning, it was 32%, but still it was a major thinning. So these two papers together kind of help solidify the fact that, wow, something is going on with the Arctic ice. The satellite data from Goddard were showing that the aerial extent of the ice and the concentration of the ice, they were decreasing. And the submarine data worked on by the group at the University of Washington were showing that the ice was thinning. So at this time, so this is 1999 that these two papers came out. And by 1999, all sorts of things had changed versus what they were in the late 1970s. In the late 1970s, computers just were nowhere near as able to handle these large data sets as they were by 1999. By 1999, people had computers on their desks. We certainly didn't have computers on our desks in the 1970s. So handling the data had become so much easier. And now people could see that there was this something really interesting happening in the Arctic sea ice cover. So these combined to make Arctic sea ice suddenly a much more notable topic than it had been in the 1970s, when almost nobody was dealing with Arctic sea ice. But Arctic sea ice then became almost like a poster child for global warming. And lots of pictures now show the Arctic sea ice, and in particular, polar bears being affected by the Arctic sea ice. Now, we have, and so ever since the late 1990s, there have been way more groups who are looking at and producing some really good results on sea ice coverage. We do continue to update our results, and this is the plot now of the monthly averages taken through the end of last year. And now you can see that even with the monthly average images, it becomes really clear that there's a decrease, especially in the summertime. The end of summer, September, which are the red dots here. I mean, it's very obvious that there's a decrease. Even though it's very obvious that there's a decrease from the monthly averages, we still do the calculation for the deviations and for the yearly averages, and those come out on this slide. So very, very clear indication of decreasing sea ice coverage, whether you calculate it with monthly deviations or whether you calculate it with yearly averages. The slopes of the least squares fit lines come out really pretty close. It's roughly 55,000 square kilometers per year loss of ice on average in the Arctic. And that's a little bit more than the combination of Maryland and New Jersey. So that's how much ice is being lost year by year in the Arctic on average over this period. So that plot, if you look at the plot on the left in particular, you can see the huge decrease that happened in 2007. And then it went up, it rebounded a bit after 2007, but then it went down even further in 2012. So the 2007 case was such a dramatic decrease that people were really wondering and speculating that there might be an ice-free Arctic even as soon as within a decade from 2007. That did not happen. As I said, there was a rebound after, but then it went down further in 2012. Joey Camiso and I did do studies on both of those two cases. And the 2007 case, the image on the left shows you what the sea ice coverage was in its record low position. And you can see on the right portion of that image how you could easily sail through a northwest passage at that point. The right plot graphic shows the red line there shows what the previous record minimum had been, which was in 2005. And look at how much less ice there was. All the colored versions on the right-hand image, those are the 2007 record low. And you can see how tremendously less it was than in even the previous record, which was 2005. Interestingly, Will Kellogg and I, way back in 1979, did publish a paper looking at what would happen if the Arctic sea ice, what would happen to the Arctic sea ice if the Arctic were to suffer a temperature increase of 5 Kelvin. And we did end up getting an ice-free Arctic at the end of summer. So I show here the standard case, the 1979 conditions, and the July case for the plus 5K situation. And that was meant to approximate doubled CO2, because that at that time, the thought was, or the models indicated about a 5K temperature increase in the Arctic for a doubling of CO2. So I show the July case here because August and September were both ice-free. And so there was no ice left in either August or September. So anyway, Will Kellogg and I did do this use of the sea ice model to look at the possibility of an ice-free Arctic. Now, here's the 2012 case where the sea ice got even more reduced than the 2007 case. And again, Joey Camiso and I looked at this, and in both the 2007 and the 2012 cases, we concluded that the sharp decreases were because of two factors. One was so-called preconditioning of the ice, meaning that the ice had already gotten down thinner and less extensive than it had been in earlier decades. So that mattered, but also the wind fields mattered. In both cases, there were wind fields that helped decrease the ice cover. But those same wind fields probably wouldn't have done much back like in the 1970s when the ice cover was much more substantial. Now, I mentioned at the bottom of this slide a paper by Zhang et al. 2013. They did a nice modeling study, and they concluded in their modeling study that the wind fields did have an impact, but even with half the wind forces, it still would have reached a record minimum. So again, something that you can do with a model that you can't do with just the observations. Now, September is the month that's talked about the most because that's the month that sea ice reaches its minimum. And so that would be the month that you would expect an ice-free Arctic to occur more quickly than any other month. But it turns out every month is showing Arctic sea ice decreases. And so this shows that September and October indeed do have the strongest decreases, at both being more than 80,000 square kilometers a year in terms of the trend over this whole period from 1979 till the end of last year. But every month has at least a loss of 30,000 square kilometers a year. So every month of the year is losing ice. And another way to look at this, and this was done with colleague Nick DiGirolamo, we plotted for each month, and so the months you could see on the left, January, February, March, April. So each month we plotted the year with the highest amount of ice as the deepest blue and the highest bar, and then goes down to lower amounts of ice, lighter blues, and then greens, and then yellows, and then with the lowest amounts of ice would be the deepest reds. And you could see from this picture that it's overwhelming. All the high values are in the early years, all the low values are in the later years. Here's a flat version of the same picture on top. And on the bottom is a graphic where we're showing each time there was a record high. Starting 1979 was sort of the baseline. So 1980, everything's going to be a record. It's either higher than 79 or lower than 79, unless it's exactly the same, which did not occur. So, but then as you get further along and the record gets longer, the highs and lows mean more. And so the record highs are the blues and the record lows are the reds. And 1986 is the last time in any month that there was a record high, which is pretty incredible. 1986, the last time any month had a record high. And since then, there were 75 record lows by the end of 2015, which is the data set we were using when we published this paper. If you update it with the next 5 years, there are 18 more record lows and no more record highs. So it's getting even more convincing. It's just hugely convincing that the Arctic is losing ice. And here's just another way to look at it. Each decade is colored a different color for the annual cycles. And the 1980s are in blue, and they're predominantly at the top. The 1990s are in green, they're predominantly the next down. And then on to the 2010s being in red, and they're predominantly at the bottom, with the 2020, that one being in the orange color. We do update things on our website, and so we update every week, and this is the results from 3 days ago, from Sunday. So it shows the Arctic situation for this year up through last Sunday, and you can see from the right plot, you can see that we're low compared to any of the previous decades, but from the left plot, you can see that we're kind of in the middle of the past decade. So so we're certainly not on line right here for a new record low, but it all depends on the weather conditions coming up. But anyway, we do update. And then another variable that I've liked looking at is the length of the sea ice season. And that simply is taking, for every pixel, count the number of days in the year that there was ice, and that's what's plotted. So in the left picture shows the results for 1979, the right picture for 2020, and you can see that it's a lot fewer days in 2020. The black hole on the left, it's much bigger for the simmer data than it is for the SSMI data. So that's why the hole is so much bigger on the left. The satellite just didn't get there. When we look at trends in these length of the sea ice season, the trends at the start, just the first 10 years, some of the areas trended toward lesser sea ice coverage in the red, some of them toward lesser sea ice season lengths, some toward greater sea ice season lengths in the greens and blues. 20-year record, far fewer greens and blues. 30-year record, even further, of almost very limited amount of anything with lengthening sea ice seasons. And the 40-year record certainly confirms that it's just overwhelmingly decreasing sea ice coverage. The decreases in sea ice in the Arctic correspond really well with all sorts of other changes happening in the Arctic. The atmosphere is warming, the ocean's warming, the coastal erosion is increasing. That's partly because the sea ice isn't there to protect the coasts. Snow seasons are shorter. Growing seasons are lengthening. That part's good. So lots of complementary changes. And so that was all predicted. All those changes were basically predicted. What wasn't predicted was the quantitative level of how much change there might be. So this was a paper by Julian Strova and her colleagues from 2007. And she shows in the red here the sea ice decreases observed, and then all the other lines are what models predicted. So the models were great in predicting that the sea ice would decrease. They did not predict quite how fast it would decrease. This all does matter, and the sea ice decreases amplify the warming through what I refer to as an amplifying feedback or enhancing feedback. Technically, it's called a positive feedback. positive makes it sound good, so that's why I prefer to just say it's an amplifying feedback. So if the system is warming, the sea ice is going to melt more, so you're going to get less sea ice. But when you get less sea ice, more of the sun's radiation is going to go into the ocean instead of being reflected back to space. So the sun's radiation stays within the Earth system and it further warms it. So that's why you've got this amplifying feedback. And when you look at global records of temperature changes, the Arctic, no matter what period you pick, the Arctic does tend to show up as amplified, as greater warming than the rest of the globe. This particular map on the left shows last year's conditions versus the 30-year mean from 1951 to 1980. And then the picture on the lower right is similar, but it's for the decade, the last decade, instead of just the last year. So now, however, despite the fact that the Arctic jives so well with what was expected, the Antarctic sea ice coverage was very different in terms of we used the exact same instruments, the same data sets, but we sure did not get the same results. So here are the February and September sea ice concentrations averaged for 1979 to 2020. And of course, it's the Southern Hemisphere, so the seasons are reversed. So February is when we've got the low amounts, September when we've got the high amounts. And when we do our plots of monthly averages, you can see that it's certainly not clear that there's a decrease, that's for sure. And when we do the monthly deviations and the yearly averages, it comes out that there's actually a slight increase. And if you notice here, 2014 was the year that it kind of peaked. And if you look at that plot and just imagine taking off everything after 2014, you can see that, you know, the increase was more convincing. Then 2014 was followed by a 3-year period where it went from the highest values that the Antarctic had in the entire 42-year record to the lowest values. I mean, it's just a huge shock. And every month was positive in terms of the trend when you go just to 2014. Now, when you take it to 2020, the decreases in the Arctic since 2014 drop this plot down every single month, and 1 month, November, actually comes out slightly in the negative, not statistically significant, but slightly in the negative in terms of the calculation. The Antarctic case was a huge surprise, so people did look at it. And so in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, we've always looked at different regions. In the Arctic, it's kind of every region showing a decrease. In the Antarctic, there was an anomalous region, and that's the Bellingshausen-Amundsen Seas, which is right next to the Antarctic Peninsula. And that showed decreases through this long period. And that helps explain some of the attempts to explain why the Antarctic sea ice was increasing from 1979 to 2014. And so lots of people have looked into this. And so I know I'm running out of time here. So I'll just say that lots of people have looked into it, and they've tied these Antarctic sea ice increases to things like the ozone hole, the polar vortex, the southern annular mode, or SAM, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, and meltwater from the ice shelves. And some of these, you know, some of the papers I list here, like, are discounting what a previous paper had suggested, like with the ozone connection and with the meltwater connection. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. There's no consensus yet on exactly what caused the Antarctic sea ice to be increasing over this long period from 79 to 2014. There is also no consensus on what caused this huge decrease from 2014 to 2017. It went from the record high of 12.8 million square kilometers in terms of yearly average record high to a record low of 10.7 million square kilometers. That difference of 2.1 million square kilometers in the yearly average, that happened in just 3 years. The Arctic, which is so well known by now for sea ice decreases, it took over 3 decades for the Arctic to lose that much in terms of yearly average ice coverage. So just a huge question to solve. Why did this happen? And that's essentially left to the next generation. But here, this is the only other instance with something comparable to the huge decreases from 2014 to 2017. It's a paper by George Kukla and Joyce Gavin, who took Antarctic sea ice decreases in the 1970s. So with a combination of lots of different data that they were able to obtain, this decrease is comparable. So it's interesting that the only 2 cases with anything even close to this rapid a decrease, they were both in the Antarctic. One in the 1970s and then the other from 2014 to 2017. Here's the updated Antarctic plots, updated through last Sunday. And you can see that the Antarctic conditions this year are kind of readily within the range of the past decade. This shows a modeling result, and this is the last slide before the summary slide. So I wanted to conclude with the modeling result to get back to Professor Rieberg's mention of the importance of modeling as well as observations. And this modeling result, it came from a study that was led by David Rind and published in 1995. What we did here was we took the climate model from the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, the GISS climate model, and we ran it for doubled CO2. But we ran it for doubled CO2 2 different ways. We ran it the regular way for doubled CO2 with sea ice calculations and atmosphere calculations and ocean calculations, and we get the red curve. And we get that with doubled CO2, the global warming is 4.17 Kelvin. Then we reran the same model, but we didn't allow the sea ice to change year to year. We had the same seasonal cycle of sea ice every year. And we get the blue curve. And that was the only change. The only change we made in the model was sea ice, and yet it affected the warming amounts at every latitude, and it brought the warming down to 2.61 Kelvin if sea ice is not included in the calculations. And so that's a huge impact. It's like 37% or so of the warming was exclusively because of having sea ice included in the calculation. So it certainly shows the importance of sea ice. And so summary slide, importance of sea ice, certainly the previous plot shows it in terms of climate. It's also important for activities and wildlife. Value of satellites. We could not possibly have gotten records like this without satellites. I mean, you could not have airplanes circling a coverage as wide, as large as the Arctic and Antarctic sea ice areas daily or even monthly. I mean, it just is not feasible. So the satellites were tremendously important for our getting this record. They sure show Arctic sea ice has decreased a lot. They sure show that the Antarctic has not been going in the way people anticipated in terms of it had large increases. Well, it had increases. They weren't nearly as substantial as the Arctic sea ice decreases, but they had increases until 2014 and then huge decreases. Globally, it's been decreasing throughout, and that's because the Arctic decreases were always outweighing the increases in the Antarctic. There's a lot of additional work to be done, a lot of work left for young scientists to try to unravel the difficulties that have been shown. And so I will end with that. Again, thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk.
Thank you so very much, Claire, for that amazing talk. It's hard because we can't hear everyone's applause. So we do have several questions, though, that have kind of appeared in the box for panelists. So would you like me to read them to you, or do you have access to them? So the first one is, what is causing the low frequency variation approximately 5 years of yearly averages of Antarctica sea ice extent?
Okay, I have to just answer that. I don't know. I don't know. And one of the things that I like about being a NASA scientist is our main purpose is to get the data sets as good as we can and get them out. And we're specifically not supposed to go to policy, and I know that the question was not regarding policy, but basically our job is get as good data sets as we possibly can, get them out, make them available, and all our data sets are available at the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder. So, so I leave it to others to figure out why these happen. But it is a good question for others to. I mean, this is certainly a good topic for others to look into.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to read the next question. Is there any understanding of how decadal mode of sea surface temperature variability, Atlantic, multi-decadal oscillation, or interdecadal Pacific oscillation reinforce or temporarily suppress the Arctic sea ice trend?
People have certainly looked into the connections with various oscillations. And the Pacific oscillations been looked into in both the Antarctic and Arctic cases. In the Arctic, people have looked more at like the Atlantic oscillation instead, but certainly there are papers that look at the impacts of various oscillations. But I'm not, yeah, that's not mine, but there are papers looking into it by other people.
Okay, the next question that we have is, are estimates of sea ice thickness reliable and complete enough to allow us to compare the rates of decline of sea ice concentration and of sea ice thickness? If so, is the volume declining more quickly than the area, as we would expect from the combination of aerial retreat and thinning? Or
definitely the volume is declining more because the volume does include the decreases of the thickness as well as the aerial decrease. But the first part of the question regarding the quality of the thickness estimates, the submarine data and people's measurements from the ground were the basic sea ice thickness measurements up until the altimetry. It's satellite, radar, and laser altimetry. The laser altimetry is from the IceSat missions. There was an IceSat that was launched in 2003. It lasted for several years. Then came IceSat 2, which was launched in September 2018, I think. Those two have laser altimeters that are getting the ice thickness measurements. In between those two, there was an aircraft, NASA had an aircraft program called Ice Bridge, bridging between IceSat and IceSat 2. So they're aircraft measurements, but the aircraft measurements can never be as complete as what the satellites can get. So I would answer the question by saying that we don't have a good complete record of ice thicknesses yet, but we do have instruments up, and the laser altimetry from NASA and the radar altimetry from the Europeans. These are both getting measurements of ice thickness that I think eventually will lead to really nice data sets, long-term data sets eventually, but they're not long-term. They're certainly not as long-term as what we've got with the passive microwave.
I'm muted. So fantastic presentation, especially the historical perspective on the observational record. In the time series of the Arctic, you noted several record low and now many record highs. In the beginning of the record, 1970s, 1980s, we see many record highs, but no record lows. Is this indicative that the atmospheric circulation system changed state dramatically? That is, the cold air masses trapped in the Arctic to subtropical air masses making their way to the Arctic? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I actually attribute it much more to the temperatures, and certainly the specific conditions in a given year are going to affect things, but in terms of the long-term trends, I attribute it to the Arctic is warming, and part of the reason it's warming is because it is tied to, it warms a little, sea ice decreases a little, that warms it up more. So I attribute the long-term trend more to the temperature decreases than to specific atmospheric weather conditions.
Great, thank you. So I know that you were a little hesitant to say this, but are there several known mechanisms to explain why the Antarctic sea ice increases until 2014?
Okay, so on that slide that I had up with the list of papers that have looked into this, Susan Solomon and Dave Thompson, they had a paper that was more not just looking at sea ice, but looking at conditions in the Antarctic. And they tied sea ice decreases to the ozone hole, and to the changes in the polar vortex brought about by the ozone hole. Sharon Stammerjohn tied it to the southern annular mode, the SAM, and the ENSO. John Turner and his colleagues tied it to the ozone hole, but also the Amundsen Sea low. The Amundsen Sea is positioned in between the Bellingshausen Sea and the Ross Sea. And the Bellingshausen Sea has gotten over this record up until 2014, the Bellingshausen Sea is the one that had the decreasing sea ice coverage. The Ross Sea is the one that had the biggest increases. So the Amundsen Sea is right in between these two. And there's something called the Amundsen Sea low. It's a low pressure system, and that means that the rotation, the atmospheric rotation is clockwise in the southern hemisphere. So if you think about the positioning here, the Bellingshausen Sea to the east of the Amundsen Sea is getting air coming in from lower latitudes. So it's getting warmer air coming in. So that makes sense that it's decreasing sea ice coverage. And then on the other side of this cyclonic flow, the Ross Sea is getting air coming in after it's passed over the Antarctic continent. So it's getting cold air coming in. And so it makes sense that if the Amundsen Sea low is sort of intensifying, you've got the decrease in the Bellingshausen Sea and the increase in the Ross Sea. So the Turner et al. Study did tie that together. Now, then Sigmund and Fife did a modeling study that they ended up, in their model, the ozone depletion in their model would have decreased sea ice coverage instead of increased it. So they discounted the results about the ozone depletion causing the sea ice increases. And then Cecilia Bitz and her co-author Paul Vanny, they did another modeling study with a model that included more eddy components, and they ended up confirming the Sigmund and Fife model. So in their more advanced model, they also ended up saying ozone depletion really, at least in their model, was not the cause for the increases. Then Batanja ended up with his colleagues suggesting that maybe the meltwater from the ice shelves. So you've got the ice shelves melting, and the meltwater is going to be freezing cold water, and you've got that spreading into the Southern Ocean. And so, okay, that could help increase the extent of the ice. You know, you've got this freezing cold water. So that made some sense. But then Swart and Fife ended up discounting the meltwater. And then Jerry Meal and his colleagues ended up showing in their results that they felt that the interdecadal Pacific Oscillation and the Amundsen Sea low, the combination of those two, could have been really strong contributing factors. So all of those papers do address the issue, but there is not a consensus yet. And there again, the way science advances is that people look into things and discover new things. And this should be certainly a topic that like a graduate student could delve into and maybe come up with something better than any suggestions that have been made so far.
Getting close to the end because Claire has a meeting with the ESS graduate student, but I want to just read maybe the last question. Dr. Parkinson's career is remarkable and inspiring. Her work has spanned decades, and over that time, there have been big changes in technology, methods, satellite imagery, and more. How did you adapt to the changes in the field? And what advice can you offer for keeping up with a changing field?
Okay, I think you do have to be, you do have to recognize that the fields do change. Something that's common now is going to change, and you have to be adaptable. You have to be flexible, you have to be adaptable. And I would say basically that's adaptability, flexibility, that's key. And also you got to be open to continually learning because new techniques come out. So continual learning. And in my case, I would say one way that was important for me was to keep in mind how lucky we are to be scientists, to be able to actually get paid for trying to understand the world. You know, I mean, we really are fortunate. In most of human history, people did not get paid for being scientists. I mean, most of the famous scientists early on, they were independently wealthy, or they, you know, we're just very lucky. We can get paid for trying to understand the world. And so I think that if you keep in mind how lucky we are, some of the frustrations maybe become less frustrating.
Thank you very much. I think that was the perfect question to end on for today, because it kind of wraps up very well and leads into some of the discussions that we'll be having with you later this week on Friday. So I definitely think I speak for everyone when I say thank you so much for your time. And there's lots of comments in the side chat box that you can see later about everyone thanking you and how amazing your work has been over your career.
How exciting,
So,
yes.
I can't see the chat, so I hope someone saves it for me because I'd love to read.
We will.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
certainly. So we will let you have your break before your talk with the grad students. Isabella, I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off.
No, it's okay. Well, thank you so much, Claire, and thank you for everybody for attending.